You can't do like your normal thing.
No, you just got to get in there.
Solo club and hit it.
That's
Look at that stance he's got.
He's just taking way too much time. He's been fairly dramatic here.
Johnny Miller spent 22 years behind an NBC microphone. And in that time, he became the most uncomfortable man in golf broadcasting. Not because he was wrong, because he was usually right. And he said it while the camera was still rolling. 5 names. 5 moments where Miller didn't just call a shot. He called the man taking it. Starting with Tiger Woods, a 2013 drop, and one word that the golf world is still arguing about: borderline. To understand why Miller's callouts landed differently from anyone else's, you need to understand what he was before he picked up a microphone. Miller won the 1973 U.S. Open at Oakmont, shooting a final round 63 that remains one of the most extraordinary performances in major championship history. He won the 1976 Open Championship at Royal Birkdale. He was, for a stretch in the mid-1970s, the best player on the planet, and he played with a precision that felt almost mechanical. Irons from 200 yards that finished inside 5 feet. Approach shots hit with a nonchalance that made the difficulty invisible. When Miller stood over a shot, galleries went quiet, not because they were told to, but because they sensed something worth watching was about to happen. That matters, because it built the credibility that made his broadcasting career so combustible. When Johnny Miller said a player had got lucky, or that a swing was breaking down under pressure, or that a particular decision showed poor judgment, he wasn't a journalist reading notes. He was a man who had stood in exactly those situations and knew, from the inside, what sound thinking looked like and what panic dressed up as confidence looked like. Viewers felt that. Rivals resented it. The tour occasionally winced at it. NBC kept him for 2 decades regardless. His style in the booth was almost the opposite of the diplomatic consensus that most sports broadcasting defaults to. Where other commentators softened observations with qualifiers, Miller stripped them back. Where others found reasons to praise, Miller found reasons to question. It wasn't cruelty, or at least it never read as cruelty, if you watched enough of him to understand the pattern. What it was, consistently, was a refusal to pretend that what he was watching was better than it actually was. He called Seve Ballesteros the greatest front 9 player in the world. On the same afternoon, he suggested Seve couldn't be trusted over the back 9 when it mattered most. He questioned whether certain Ryder Cup selections made sense, while those players were still active participants in the competition. He assessed putting strokes the way a surgeon might assess an X-ray, clinically, without much interest in whether the patient found the diagnosis uncomfortable. The golf establishment never quite knew what to do with him. Tournament directors learned to brace for the weekends when NBC had the broadcast rights. Players developed a particular awareness of whether Miller was calling their round, because his commentary had a way of following them off the course and into the press room, where journalists would ask about whatever he'd said 2 holes earlier. It created a feedback loop that no other broadcaster in the sport had managed to generate, where what Miller said during the round became part of the story of the round. What made the 5 moments we're about to look at different from his standard issue criticism was the nature of the target. These weren't observations about technique, or course management, or club selection. These were verdicts on character, on intent, on whether certain players were actually playing the game properly, in the fullest sense of that word. Some of them questioned the rules. 5 names. One man who decided that honesty was a professional obligation, not a diplomatic option. Let's start with the one that made the whole sport stop and argue. Let's start where it stings most. The year is 2013, and Tiger Woods is in the middle of one of the more carefully managed image rebuilds in the history of professional sport. The personal scandals of 2009 had fractured something that once felt permanent, and the years since had been a slow, deliberate reconstruction. Every tournament was another data point in the recovery narrative. Every Sunday leaderboard appearance was another chapter in a story the golf world genuinely wanted to have a clean ending. Tiger arrived at TPC Sawgrass that May as the world #1. He was playing some of the best golf of his post-2009 career, and the Players' Championship had the feel of a coronation waiting to happen. Then came the 14th hole, a shot into the water and a drop that set off the loudest argument the rules of golf had produced in years. What happened next on the NBC broadcast is what separates this from a dozen other rules disputes that come and go without leaving a mark. Johnny Miller opened his mouth. That Tiger drop was really, really borderline. I can't live with myself without saying that. Sit with that word, borderline. Miller didn't say illegal. He didn't say wrong. He chose a word that lives in the space between a clean conscience and a deliberate choice. And he chose it about the most scrutinized athlete on the planet, while the broadcast was still live and the gallery was still watching. That's not an accident of phrasing. Miller was too experienced a broadcaster and too precise a thinker about the game to reach for a word without knowing exactly what it carried. Borderline means you understood the rule. It means you located the line, assessed your options, and placed yourself as close to the advantageous side of it as the letter of the law would permit. It doesn't accuse you of cheating outright. It does something more corrosive than that. It suggests awareness. It implies calculation. And once that implication is in the air on live television, with millions of viewers watching, no amount of procedural clarification fully scrubs it clean. Tiger's camp responded quickly, and the tone wasn't measured. The pushback from his team arrived with the energy of people who understood exactly what Miller's framing had done, and wanted it walked back before it calcified into the public record. Miller didn't walk anything back. He stood by the word, stood by the sentiment, and made clear he'd repeat both if the question was put to him again. The tour's own review eventually landed on a 2-shot penalty for Tiger, confirming that a rule had been violated. That settled the procedural question. What it didn't settle, and what no ruling body ever could settle, was the character question Miller had raised. Because the penalty answered what happened. Miller's borderline answered something about why. And that's the part that followed Tiger out of the tournament and into the broader conversation about who he was, when the rules gave him room to maneuver. What makes this the sharpest moment on the list is the context Miller chose to ignore. In 2013, the golf world was broadly invested in Tiger's return. Journalists were writing about redemption. Sponsors were back. Galleries were loud and loyal again. There was a version of events where any broadcaster with a full understanding of the sport's commercial and emotional landscape looked at that drop, noted it was being reviewed, and let the process run without editorializing. That version required a degree of self-censorship that most broadcasters in that position would have deployed without even registering it as a choice. Miller registered it as a choice and went the other way. He'd spent 2 decades watching the golf world treat Tiger with a deference that occasionally crossed into something closer to reverence, where the rules of scrutiny that applied to everyone else quietly softened when the subject was the game's biggest draw. Miller had no interest in that arrangement. The credibility he'd built from his own playing career meant he didn't need the access that diplomatic broadcasters protect by staying quiet. He could afford to say borderline, absorb the fallout, and move on, without it costing him anything he wasn't prepared to lose. The Golf Channel, rival commentators, and much of the written press spent the days that followed carefully threading the needle between acknowledging the penalty and avoiding Miller's implication. They discussed the drop rule in detail. They explained the measurement process. They noted that Tiger had self-reported elements of the situation. None of it touched what Miller had actually said. Because what Miller had actually said wasn't about the geometry of the drop. It was about the geometry of a decision made by a man who knew the geometry perfectly well. Tiger went on to finish the Players' Championship tied for second. The result barely registered against the noise Miller had generated from one sentence delivered in the moment it mattered most. That's what separated Miller from everyone else in that booth over 22 years. He understood that the broadcast wasn't just a description of the golf. It was part of the record, and he intended to put something in the record that couldn't be quietly revised later. One broadcaster, one word, and a controversy that the sport is, in certain corners, still having. Tiger's case was built around a rules question with a measurable answer. The tour reviewed the footage, assessed the drop, and handed down a penalty. There was a process, there was an outcome. What Miller did to Ian Poulter and Andrew Loop operated in entirely different territory, because neither man had broken a written rule. What they'd done, in Miller's estimation, was something harder to codify and just as unforgivable. The 2013 Hyundai Tournament of Champions at Kapalua was not a pleasant week to be standing on a golf course. The wind came in hard off the Pacific, the rain arrived sideways, and the conditions were the kind that separate players who compete through discomfort from players who let discomfort compete for them. Ian Poulter, by Miller's reading, belonged in the second category. He watched for a while and then delivered his verdict with the calm of a man confirming something he'd already decided. He's just taking way too too much time. He's being fairly dramatic here. That's not a pace of play complaint logged with a rules official. That's a diagnosis of how a man was choosing to exist on a golf course when things got hard. Miller wasn't saying Poulter was slow. He was saying Poulter was performing. That the grimacing, the deliberation, the drawn-out routine wasn't preparation. It was theater. And the audience was every other player on the course. Plus, everyone watching at home, milking the conditions rather than grinding through them. For Miller, who had played in weather that would make Kapalua feel like a practice round, that distinction between enduring and displaying was not a small one. Poulter had always carried a certain flair for the dramatic. His Ryder Cup record gave him license that a lesser player wouldn't have had. And his personality, combative and loud and unapologetically visible, was part of what made him compelling to watch. Miller didn't care about any of that context. He watched what was happening in front of him and said what he saw. And what he saw was a man using bad weather as a costume. Andrew Loup arrived in Miller's crosshairs the following year under completely different circumstances. The 2014 Valero Texas Open, decent conditions, no weather drama to blame, and a pre-shot routine that was grinding the broadcast towards something approaching stasis. Miller had spent 2 decades watching players prepare to hit shots, and he had a calibrated sense of where careful preparation ended and where something else entirely began. Loup's routine crossed that line so comprehensively that it produced the most quoted slow play line of Miller's career. If everyone on tour played like him, I'd quit announcing. Neither Poulter nor Loup were accused of bending the rules the way Tiger had been, but Miller had found a different kind of line for them to stand too close to, and he'd announced, on air, exactly how close they were standing. Poulter and Loup were called out for how they moved through a round. What Miller did at Brookline in 1999 was categorically different. He didn't question a player's pace or his demeanor. He questioned whether a player had any right to still be standing on the course. The 1999 Ryder Cup was already tense before Miller opened his mouth. Brookline was the kind of venue that compressed everything. The crowd noise, the pressure, the history of American golf, all bearing down on a single weekend. Justin Leonard was part of a US team, still mid-competition, still out on the course, when Miller delivered his verdict live on NBC. My hunch is that Justin needs to go home and watch it on television, not post-round, not in a column published the following morning, where the subject might have a chance to see it coming. Mid-tournament, mid-broadcast, with Leonard still competing and the gallery still watching. Miller looked at what he was seeing and concluded, publicly,
that one of the players on the course would be better served as a spectator. That's not a performance critique. That's a competitive death sentence delivered in real time to an audience of millions. And Leonard had no mechanism to respond to it while it was happening, because he was still out there trying to prove it wrong. Ricky Fowler's entry on this list is almost the mirror image of Leonard's, and that's precisely what makes it interesting. Leonard was visibly struggling when Miller buried him. Fowler had just won the 2017 Honda Classic, a genuine result. Fowler had got it done. The leaderboard confirmed it, and the moment was his. Then Miller spoke, and the moment became something else. A win is a win, but you've got to learn to finish out Sundays like a true champion. He hasn't learned how to do that yet. Seconds after the final putt dropped, not during a difficult stretch, not in response to a blown lead, but in the immediate aftermath of a victory, Miller had found the crack inside the achievement before anyone had finished celebrating it, and he named it on air with the same calm he'd used to deliver every other verdict across 2 decades in that booth. The but in that sentence is doing a specific kind of damage. A win is a win grants just enough before taking everything back. It acknowledges the scoreboard while simultaneously suggesting the scoreboard doesn't tell the full story. What Miller was saying, stripped of the diplomatic wrapper, was that Fowler had won without becoming a winner, that the result was real, and the player behind it still wasn't quite. To understand why Miller went after Fowler at that specific moment, you need to understand what Sunday finishing meant to Miller as a competitor. His 1973 US Open final round at Oakmont, that 63, wasn't just a low score. It was a performance under conditions that had reduced the rest of the field to ordinary golf. And he had produced something that looked like a different sport entirely. That experience gave him a very particular set of standards for what it actually meant to close on a Sunday. And he applied those standards without adjustment, regardless of who was crossing the finish line. Fowler's record going into 2017 had a specific shape to it. Multiple top 5 finishes in majors without a breakthrough. Stretches of brilliance, followed by final round positions that left the door open slightly longer than they should have. He was a compelling player to watch, and a difficult one to predict, which made him popular with galleries and complicated for Miller, who preferred his assessments to have clean edges. Fowler didn't give him clean edges. What he gave him instead was a pattern, and Miller read the pattern and announced it the moment a result briefly obscured it. Leonard, in his view, had failed the obligation to compete at a level the Ryder Cup demanded. Fowler, in his view, had failed the obligation to win the way a proper champion wins, with authority rather than survival. Both verdicts arrived without invitation. Both arrived live, on air, in the moment the subject was least positioned to absorb them, and both lodged themselves in the public record in a way that no subsequent result, no subsequent performance, no subsequent defense from either player's team could fully dislodge. That's the mechanism Miller relied on across all 5 moments in this list. He wasn't trying to start arguments, though arguments reliably followed. He was trying to put something true, or something he believed was true, into the record before the broadcast moved on and the moment closed. He trusted the record more than he trusted the conversation, and the record, in every one of these cases, held. 5 names, 5 moments. One man who treated honesty as a professional obligation rather than a diplomatic option. Miller's legacy in that booth is the proof that the most dangerous person in any room is the one who's already decided they have nothing to lose. Subscribe and watch the next video.